Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Wang, Senior Editor at Lumina Foundation. Welcome to our session, The Higher Ed Headlines More Americans Need to Read. We will take questions at the end of the session, so I want you to be thinking about them, and we'll have time for you all to come up to the mics in the middle of the room. So higher ed is in a tough spot right now. Colleges and universities are facing some serious questions as people are losing confidence in higher ed, wondering about the rising costs and whether their degrees will pay off when they are looking for jobs. But at the same time, in surveys, people recognize the importance of a college degree to their individual success, the success of their communities, and to the success of the nation at large. You'll also hear people talk about the importance of higher ed when governors, for example, talk about building talent pipelines for in-demand, highly skilled, good-paying jobs that attract industries that bolster local economies. When it comes to the community college campus in your neighborhood that's training people you know to get better jobs in your community, people have much more confidence. So today, we'll talk about how getting down to the local level can help higher ed find a way forward in these challenging times. We know our local colleges and universities. We drive past them or through them. We go to sporting events there, to concerts, to shows. We know people who go there, our friends' kids, our coworkers take classes there, our babysitters, and our swim instructor go there. And that's because most American undergraduates go to college very close to home. The median distance that they travel is just 17 miles. And almost half of all students, about 43%, are attending community colleges. But national media tends to focus very narrowly on highly selective institutions that less than 1% of American students attend. And that is what is shaping these larger media narratives about higher education. We see parallels with trust in local news versus trust in national news. So while the national news can be highly polarizing, Americans largely believe local journalists are doing a good job of covering important stories in their communities and reporting on them accurately. That's from a recent Pew Research Center report. People can see the local connections that reporters have, and they believe that the local news outlets are important to the well-being of their communities. But the challenge here is that local news has lost a lot of revenue with the decline of print advertising and are closing at a rate of more than 2 per week. Many communities have lost their sources of local news or seen them greatly diminished. The opportunity here is that local news is still stepping up. It just might not look like your local newspaper anymore or your evening TV news. As local news outlets are transforming and looking for ways to be financially sustainable, one of the avenues is to become a nonprofit news outlet. And as these nonprofit news outlets seek funding through grant support or from individual donors, they're focusing on the value that they bring to communities. Who are they serving? How are they reaching them? And what kind of news and information do people need? At Lumina, we work towards increasing the number of adults with college degrees or other credentials of value. And one of our strategies in this work is to support increased coverage of national higher education and workforce training issues. And that's because we weren't seeing the coverage that was reflective of today's students that we believe would help people better understand higher ed. We also support efforts to improve local news. And in addition to my higher ed philanthropy hat, I'm bringing to this conversation my past as a local higher education reporter. I used to say that higher education is the best beat in town. I still believe that. There's just so many compelling stories to be told about students and their journey and so much potential to highlight how systems are or aren't working for students and spark real changes that can help many more students in their journeys. So I'm really excited for today's conversation on rebuilding trust in higher ed and in the news, which are two public goods that are working to strengthen our communities. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. Sara Hebel is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Open Campus, a nonprofit newsroom that ensures communities have the news and information they need about higher ed. Open Campus is a Lumina grantee, and several years ago, they looked across the media landscape and discovered that most major American cities didn't have a dedicated higher education beat reporter. Now Open Campus works full-time or works with full-time beat reporters in 17 communities across the country. And as a fun fact, I was once a reporter in the Open Campus Network and can tell you that Open Campus is like a power-up in Super Mario Brothers. You're instantly supercharged.
I've heard that before.
You're welcome to use it. They instantly supercharge your abilities to cover higher education because of their deep expertise and understanding of the context across different states. Graciela Mochkofsky is the Dean of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. At the J School, she has launched a bilingual master's journalism program. She's led the school's Center for Community Media, and she now has the task of making the school tuition-free by 2027. Christina Shih is the Associate Director of Press Forward, a national network of 88 funders, including Lumina, that have committed more than $500 million to strengthening communities through better local news and information. In her role, Christina has supported the creation of 36 local chapters of Press Forward. That includes cities, so there's Press Forward Chicago. It includes states like Press Forward Minnesota, and regions like Press Forward Central Appalachia. And these local chapters are driven by local funders who are launching place-based initiatives to support the information needs of their communities. So Sara, I'm wondering if you can start us off by telling us about a community that Open Campus works in, and what did local news on higher education look like before, and what does the increased coverage of higher ed mean for that community?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stephanie. And yeah, like Stephanie said, we really approach our coverage from the standpoint that higher education is a local story, that it matters because people are going to college close to home. State policies are driving so much of what is happening at campuses and for students. And so we really believe that it's important to support and seed really expert coverage for people about the future of their communities, because that's what we see is at stake. One place that I'll point to is Mississippi. We work there with Mississippi Today. Before we helped Mississippi Today get a full-time higher education reporter, nobody had been covering that beat for at least 20 or 30 years. So people weren't going to the very basic public meetings, the state governing board, just people didn't have the information they needed to engage in public dialogue about really important issues that affect their future. So one particular example to point out is a student aid debate where a few years ago the state was proposing to shift how student aid is awarded more toward merit aid, away from needs-based aid. And it's a policy that was sort of fast-tracked. It was just going to take effect without much public conversation. Our reporter was at the meeting, heard this was happening, had sources that were giving her documents off the record, and she was able to then take that information, report out the proposal, what it would mean. We helped her build an interactive, database that would help people, individuals in the state, put in some basic information and get a sense of how it would affect them. It led students then to be active and protest. In fact, some of them went to college game day at the University of Mississippi with signs right in the front row. They staked out to be on TV protesting this thing. And because of the activism, that policy was put on hold until there could be a fuller discussion of it. So that's one example of how we are trying to work to help people in communities have the information they need to understand what policymakers are what that means for them, and give them the power that they need to be able to be active in the conversation. Mississippi Today has told us that the higher education beat is one of their most popular beats. It's something that helps them drive revenue. So it's also helping us do what we are trying to accomplish on the journalism front, which is to empower reporters with information, but also empower newsrooms to be more financially robust and to layer their coverage with important topics like higher education that really matter.
Great. Graciela, what role do you see a journalism school playing in helping to rebuild this trust in higher ed?
Thank you. I went to journalism school. I've been a reporter. I'm from Argentina originally, so the bilingual program we launched at CUNY, at the Newmark J School at CUNY, was Spanish-English. And the journalism schools in the past had a very different role. It helped me a lot. I became a much better reporter. I went to journalism school in the mid-90s. But at that time, it wasn't, if you missed journalism school, if you didn't go, there were enough resources in the newsrooms, enough mentorship, enough guidance, enough editors, enough resources to make you a really good reporter. And this is a profession in which, it's a craft. You learned by doing it and doing it and doing it, and you get better. And of course, education can always help and make you better and give you resources that you would take longer to acquire. But that is not the situation we find ourselves at right now. Right now, because of the crisis in the journalism industry, there's very few newsrooms here and around the world that actually have the capacity to train people, to mentor people, to get people to advance in their careers. That there's just simply not enough resources because the industry is going through a serious moment of transformation and financial crisis, and we're all trying to figure out what the industry of the future looks like. And so journalism schools have now an extraordinary new role to play. One is to build that capacity, to recruit the talent, to find the talent in this country, particularly in places where that talent wasn't coming from before. For many decades, American media became many decades ago a very middle class, Ivy League school destination. If you look at the reporters from a lot of the mainstream media organizations, you will see that they come from very similar backgrounds. That has created problems, a serious problem of disconnect with communities and with a large part of the fabric of this country. And a lot of the effort we've been doing and other schools have been doing is to recruit people from working class backgrounds, from immigrant backgrounds, from underserved communities, to bring them into the newsrooms and support them once they're in the newsrooms, so that they can, so that the newsrooms can really represent and reflect the reality of America and the reality of many communities. So CUNY and other state schools are fundamental to that effort. Our school has been around for 18 years, and I think it's probably one of the journalism school that has injected more talent of color and more people from underserved backgrounds into the newsrooms than any other school. The other role for schools right now, which is equally important, is to figure out this industry and to come up with a model for journalism that is adequate to the current society and societal and technological needs. We had an industry, there was a generation 120 years ago or so that came up with the model that became American journalism. That was not a universal model. That was not given by, God. That was created by a generation. It was very specific to the societal and technological needs of this country at that time. Mass distribution, the way people consume news, the way technology allow for us to distribute those news was very specific to a moment. And the model of journalism we still have and we see crumbling now was created for that situation. The society has moved on. People don't get their news in the same way. People don't learn things in the same way. People consume everything in a different way. The digital revolution changed everything more than about 30 years ago for news. And a journalism school is the place where a new generation needs to design a news industry that is adequate to the society we have now. So that is a very painful process because the industry is still very much the culture in the newsrooms and the financial and the structure of news is still transitioning to this new way, to this new world. And AI is, of course, now fastly changing things even further. And so what we are doing in our school is trying to, education is about the future. That's what we do. We create, we empower the people who will make the future. And in journalism, that is now a very, very critical, important role, because again, we need to come up with something new. A lot of people are doing that. There's a lot of experimentation. If you're in New York, I invite you to come through our school. It's actually at a moment of deep crisis, both in higher ed and in journalism. It's a place in which you have a feeling that things are thriving and that people are really, with their eyes open to the problems, but we are really focusing on solutions, and that is a very exciting thing to do right now.
Christina, can you tell us a little bit more about what this transformation of local news might look like, particularly for a reader, and what kinds of approaches local news is testing for rebuilding trust with readers?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say thank you so much for having us, and thank you if there are educators and teachers who are in the room. In our work, we often think of our journalists as frontline workers who are working in service of their communities to equip and report and provide us with factual information for our daily lives. And in some ways, teachers are doing the exact same thing in the classroom, battling misinformation, working with students to understand complex issues and the sources that are shaping them. And, our team at Press Forward, we work at a national level with about 88 funders. And we go all across the country, and it doesn't matter where we are, from Miami to Minneapolis, Kansas to Mississippi. Everyone we talk to says that they feel like they have less local news. And I want to be clear that this is local news, not information, because there is no shortage of information. It's coming to us all the time on our content on our phones and devices. But this is, the local reporting that really binds communities together. And I'm curious, if folks even remember a time, just get a show of hands, maybe when you or a family member or friend was in the local paper, for sports or maybe, a wedding announcement, and you think about the impact that this has on building civic connection. And so part of our work is to really help a variety of stakeholders understand where we are now and see some of the bright spots that are taking place. Because we know that the stakes are high. On one level, when you don't have access to local news, you don't know what to do for fun on the weekends. You may not know what's happening in the school board or at your children's school. Or in high stakes situation after a natural disaster, you don't know where to get access to resources and life-saving information. So where we are, it's what we can see, it's not all doom and gloom. There are a lot of bright spots and a lot of solutions. Open campus, CUNY, and so many of us are kind of working at every part of this issue, and we're able to see solutions that can have real impact at scale. Things are being implemented and experimented in local areas that can have an impact across the country. I just want to share, a staggering stat. There is this local news desert study, and the Northwestern School says about 1,700 to 1,800 counties are considered news deserts or at high risk, meaning they don't have a single local news source. And there also is about 1,300 universities and colleges that are in or adjacent to these news deserts. However, when we're talking about formal journalism programs, there's only about 70 schools that offer that. So when we think about this gap and the potential and what we could do to be creative, to build a talent pipeline, to think about other avenues into getting into this work and the variety of ways we can all be part of the solution, I think we can harness a lot of potential for our communities and our democracy. So, some examples, we can get into it, Journalism Design School partnering with community colleges, University of Vermont thinking about how do they train different students from not formal journalism majors to think about the essentials of reporting to increase access of reliable news in communities. Or data scientists and researchers coming together to do mapping at scale to see information gaps. These are all part of the solutions that may not always look like a traditional newspaper.
Sara, Graciela, I'm wondering, when you think about how local news earns trust, are there things that higher ed can learn from what local news is doing?
I mean, I think, it's interesting because working in journalism and journalism about higher education, I feel like I'm sitting at the intersection of mistrust or something, and can see parallels in both ways. I think the way that we think about trust and building it in journalism is about putting expert resources on these beats and really helping people connect with their communities and show communities how higher education is central to the future of their communities by doing reporting that is knowing, that helps people understand what's at stake and what matters. And I think the other thing too is showing up. Having somebody at the meetings, having somebody in the communities and talking to people about what they misunderstand, what's missing in the conversation, and figuring out how to add that. So, I mean, I think from my perspective, that mirrors a lot of what you see with higher education in terms of how our colleges and officials thinking about their roles in their own backyards and in their communities, and how are they communicating that effectively to the people who live next door to them. And I would like to encourage them to work with us as an independent news source, right, to help us communicate that as well, because I think sometimes it's easy for higher education to think about what they can do to help people, and that's great, but I don't think there always is enough of a two-way conversation happening as there could be, and I think that's a problem that we faced in journalism as well, right? In the past, it was like, oh, I am a decider about what information people need, and I will give them their vegetables, and they will read it because that is what they should do. But instead, I think people are disengaged because journalists aren't actually listening and hearing what they need. So I think a lot of it sounds simplistic, but to me, a lot of it is connection. It's building community. It's taking people seriously. It's meeting people where they are. And I think that really can matter for beginning to chip away at some of the skepticism and even sometimes antagonism that people feel. And I don't mean to monopolize the time, but just to build on something that both were saying, I think one thing that has become ever clearer to us at Open Campus, we started this to try to solve some gaps in news desert problems and in subject matter problems and in an area that we care deeply about and think really matters to the future of communities. But the development, the professional development part is something that has become ever more prominent to us and ever more central to our mission, which is that local newsrooms don't have some of the capacity they used to have to work with early career talent, to help people really excel and propel in their careers. And so a lot of what we see our role as being extra editors who can come in and train people. And we do monthly workshops, we do in-person summits, we provide all kinds of resources and guides to help people do their jobs well, and not just on higher education topics like what are indirect costs and what does that mean for the future of federal research, but also how to file FOIA requests. We have a reporter in one of our news organizations that we work with who had not filed a single public records request when we started working with her. And now she's turning regularly out investigative pieces that are holding her institutions and her community to account, and it's changing behavior. And so I think that we're able to inspire confident reporting, which then translates into high quality reporting, which then hopefully can translate into trust.
I would say for trust, there's I think the trust conversation is much bigger than what we can tackle here, because there's, in the world, a majority of people have less and less trust in institutions in general. So it's not just media, it's government, it's their local, the national representative. It's a very, it's health, it's science, it's systems that people feel don't work for them. So to me, when we look at trust and news around, trust in news, and that's a big focus of our teaching and our thinking at the school, I'm thinking about two values. One is relevance, the other one is accountability. And relevance is critical, because if people don't feel they need news, accurate news, to make decisions in their lives, then what is it that we're doing? So it needs to feel relevant to them. If it feels superfluous, and if it's something that they only go to when there's a crisis, and we've seen this during the pandemic, we've seen this recently during the fires in LA, that people, suddenly local outlets saw this huge increase in readership, and people started, people needed them for their lives to even survive. They needed accurate news, and it's not the same to get news that you can't trust. But we need to be relevant to the everyday, person, every day to people. And so we're thinking about that, and I think listening is a big part of that. And I've seen a lot of extraordinary successful experiences and experimentation around listening. There's now all this movement of outlets that reach out to people, and you can only do that locally because of the scale, but it's really working locally. Outlets that reach out to people, they connect to people directly through their phones, through their, through text messaging platforms, and they engage in conversation. They ask what is it that they need to know that they can't know otherwise without news media, and then they create a news agenda that is bottom up. I don't think that alone is enough. I think there's still things that people may not know they need to know, and that it's our judgment, and that's our profession, to say, okay, you also need to know about this because there's something happening in China that will come and hit you here, in a few months. So you need to be, and you don't know that you need to know that. But there is a sense of empowering the audience or the public, and getting them and creating this relationship. Trust is always relationship, right? This is how we trust people. And then accountability, and accountability is equally important, and it means that if we get it wrong, and we get it wrong, it's an imperfect method, journalism, and it's fast, and it's gone faster. So we will get it wrong many times, but when we get it wrong, you admit that you got it wrong and you correct it. And it's this constant effort of, just getting it right again and again, and making sure that people understand how it works, and that you're going to be honest. So this honesty is very important, and it kind of goes against a very deep cultural element in newsrooms and in journalism. And I come from that training and background, which is that you're very defensive and thin-skinned, and you don't like to admit that you got it wrong because it's embarrassing. But you have to, because when you get it wrong, you need to, and it makes you stronger. And I've seen a new culture, coming from local newsrooms, that because they have this relationship, they are able to say this and to explain and to admit and to correct when they made a mistake. So I think those elements are very important, and we are working on another role for journalism schools is changing culture. There's a huge role of education in general and journalism schools for the purposes of this conversation, which is to create a new culture of service, and where there's not an entitled, culture in which we know more and we educate the public. We're not educating the public. We're informing them. We're serving their needs, and we need to understand their needs to serve them.
Yeah, just to add to the relevance part too, and thinking about this current climate that we're in and how local news plays into that, I think a lot of what we're working with our reporters on now is taking what's happening at that federal level and really helping people understand what's at stake, what hangs in the balance for them in their backyards, whether it's the Alzheimer's research that's happening at Indiana University in Indianapolis, or whether it's, what's changing on the DEI front on campuses in Mississippi, and why you might not understand what that really means because it's covered in this lingo that you don't really get sort of underneath. And that's, I think, a role journalism can play to help people understand why they should care and what's at stake. And when you're talking about accountability, I heard you say, be human, right? I think journalists, if we can just be human and connect with people outside of this kind of officialdom that we were trained back in the 90s to kind of have, which is this, I am so, outside of, it's almost robotic. And so just being more genuine with people and admitting when we're wrong, engaging with them more genuinely, I think goes a long way.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've had the chance to work with this rise of nonprofit startup newsrooms, and many of them are former editors and reporters that came from that environment and now have a fresh opportunity to think about what does it look like to build a newsroom culture that retains staff, has everybody invested in the community, and ultimately delivers long-term value to the community. And so we're seeing a lot of deep listening, a lot of focus groups, again, just going, where do you get your news? What issues keep you up at night? What do you think is not being covered? And using that in their editorial strategies. But there are also so many creative solutions that get everybody involved. One of the programs that I love is Documenters, which comes out of a Chicago-based newsroom called City Bureaus, but it's now in, I think, 12 different cities across the country. Basically, they teach folks to be documenters, and you can apply to become a documenter. Anybody can apply. You get training on how to attend city council meetings, take notes, and upload them to a repository that many journalists can access and use that information for their own reporting. And you also get paid for it. So this is a foray and entry point for many people to see themselves as part of that solution and maybe have a different type of pipeline into a new type of newsroom that we may not have seen before. So these are, again, how do we see all of ourselves in this issue? And then, of course, being able to connect the dots, too.
I'm so glad you brought up Documenters. It's a great example. So when we talk about this pipeline and building the ranks of journalists, how do we ensure that journalists who are telling the story of higher ed might have experiences that are reflective of the experiences of most American students? We talk about a lot of journalists coming from J schools, at more selective universities, and I also think about how that drives maybe an impulse to sometimes describe students as non-traditional if they're attending part-time or if they're older. But if actually most students are older and working part-time, are they non-traditional? So we talk a little bit about building a pipeline that is more reflective of society?
I mean, we definitely see the effects of having people who do have different backgrounds. When we started a partnership with Houston Landing, next door to here, we were talking about what's missing in the higher education coverage in Houston. And both of the editors we were talking with on the call had gone to a community college. And so right away, they were talking about how, only 80 people in Houston went to the nearby fancy, 4-year research university, but tens of thousands of people in Houston are going to the community college systems. And so I think that was a real clear manifestation of why it does matter to have people with different educational backgrounds in our newsrooms, especially when you're talking about covering the higher education beat. I think, efforts starting at the, college level, right, to pull people into this world that come from a wide range of backgrounds are helpful. Documenters, like bringing the general public into understanding the importance of public information to democracy and showing them that they can do good work in reflecting what their public officials are saying, I think helps broaden this understanding that a lot of people can be journalists. A lot of people should be journalists. And so how do we figure out then also the support systems that are in newsrooms that have lost the support systems to then bring people who have come from a range of backgrounds into the professional world, and to also have newsrooms that are oriented toward embracing and learning from those perspectives. I think, I'm just pointing at the problems, I guess, but I think a lot of these efforts that all of us are making to recognize that problem and to find ways to start building in systems that are deliberately opening up pathways are really critical if we're going to be able to do meaningful journalism that is reflecting what communities need to know.
I'll tell you two things we're doing. One thing is we are trying to raise enough money to be tuition-free by 2020, for the class of 2027. Journalism schools are very expensive, except for us. No, except for state schools or public university systems. We are the graduate school of journalism of the University of New York, which is the largest public urban university system in the world, and also an extraordinary institution in New York City that brings people up into the middle class, which is mostly working class, immigrant base. That's kind of the background of the majority, the large majority of the students in the institution, and our students as well. So, but we, as a graduate school, I realized that we had two barriers of access for the people we were trying to train and then launch into the news media field. One was that we, even though we were one of the most affordable journalism school in the country, we were still charging. New York City is a very expensive city, so if you have to pay the rent and then also you have to pay to go to graduate school, you might reconsider. And the other thing is that the other barrier, which actually was the first one we eliminated, was that you needed to pay $75 to even apply. There was an application fee. And so last year, I decided to waive the application fee. And then we announced the campaign to be tuition-free by 2027. Immediately, we saw, at a moment of huge, profound crisis in the industry, where people are fearing who's going to go into journalism school because it's, into journalism because it's this industry in crisis, and also, now it's become dangerous under this new administration. There's a lot of concern about, just really continuing to bring people into this very important field for our democracy. And when we eliminated the admissions fee, the applications fee, we had immediately a 50% increase in applications. And then this year, we just closed applications Monday, and we had a 20% increase in applications compared to the 50% increase, on top of the 50% increase last year. So, and we have seen the strongest applicant pools we've ever seen in the school in these 2 years. And more than 60% of our students are students of color, identify as students of color. A lot of them are immigrants. They're and half of them are New Yorkers, are from the state of New York. So I always say with a lot of pride, with great pride, that when you are outside, when you're in the streets, we are in Times Square, 40th Street and 40th Street and 7th Avenue. And when you're outside, you're in New York City, meaning people are from everywhere and people look from very different backgrounds, and you hear the languages, and it's this very exciting, thriving, diverse city. And when you go into my school, you're still in New York City, which is not the case for many institutions in the city, where you go inside the buildings and the offices and you're like, where did the city go? And I'm very proud that we serve this community. And the other thing we're doing is we are, and by making it tuition free, of course, we're going to eliminate all of the access barriers. And then the other thing we're doing is we're working with this extraordinary movement of young public high school journalist students. Is the Youth Journalism Coalition. I know that there's something similar in other states. I'm not sure in Texas. I know in California there's a similar movement, certainly in New York City. And this movement is led by high school students who go to public schools in the city. And they are demanding legislation to make journalism education required in high school in high schools in New York City, and to make sure that the schools have the resource to have their own publication, the local kind of the high school paper. And that is very important because this movement is seeing journalism education as civics education and news literacy. So that's a way to regain trust and bring back people's, just develop people's appreciation for accurate news and understanding of how important they are in our democracy. And this is an equity issue in New York City because a research paper by a colleague at in CUNY, in another school, showed that only 40 high schools, public high schools in New York City, had their own paper and access to journalism education, where the majority of the schools didn't. And the correlation is with wealth in the community is just unfortunately very clear. So the schools that have the most affluent students have a paper and have access to journalism education in high school. Most private high schools in the city have this, and most public schools don't. So that we are developing the curriculum for the high school journalism programs, and we are training the teachers. We just launched a pilot to train 30 high school teachers who are going to teach journalism to their students, and the idea is to expand it to every high school in the city.
Can I share an example? So last year, Press Forward ran this open call for funding, and we awarded $20 million to over 200 local newsrooms across the country. And we made a conscious decision to include college papers into this because oftentimes they're the only source of original reporting in communities. So out of that open call, we funded 8 newsrooms, even the student paper at the University of Guam, or a paper that covers tribal communities in Kansas. But one of the grantees that we funded was the University of Florida Independent Alligator paper. And we had the chance to hear from one of their student reporters and talk to their staff advisor, the general manager. I mean, this is a public institution, and being at the paper is not a class. This is on top of their daily jobs. And a few weeks ago, I had the chance to hear from one of their reporters who went through community college. Her personal background, her journey was, she faced housing insecurity, unstable family life at home, and she thought that she had this imposter syndrome, that she could never make it in a newsroom. But what she brings out of that lived experience is a curiosity, resilience to be able to hold power to account and report on really important issues. And one of her investigations led to the firing of the university president for mismanagement of spending. And that's a real impact at a public institution. And so we see the power and potential that comes with uplifting a student who has an untraditional background, what they can do to shed light on important issues. But at the same time, what she is facing and what that paper is facing are all of the same challenges that newsrooms, professional newsrooms, are facing when it comes to legal challenges, pressures from leadership, and there is now a collective responsibility to think about how do we support those types of organizations where they're just students, they're also doing midterms and finals, but doing a lot of the same important work that traditional journalists are, but student journalists are journalists.
So before we open it up for questions, I'm going to dust off my cranky ex-reporter hat and ask, how can higher ed better tell its own story? Because colleges and universities don't always make that easy.
We've been talking a lot about this recently as colleges are figuring out how to respond or not to respond to the flurry of dear colleague letters and executive orders that are coming, rolling to them, and as they also are facing state legislative actions as well. And I think that many leaders right now are being silent, and I think that's problematic because at some point, I think it's important for communities to understand where people stand and where they hold values and what values they will stick to and fight for. And I get that it's a time of fear, and I get that it's a time of chaos. And so I know that this is like a simple ask, but not an easy one. But I do think when there is a lot of confusion, when there's a lot of fear, that people in communities, people on their campuses are feeling it, and they aren't understanding kind of where institutions are coming from and what they will fight for. So I think, one quick answer I have to that is communicate. Communicate directly, communicate clearly, and even when you don't know, say you don't know. Help people understand that you are in many ways on their side, because I think sometimes the institutions are, but aren't saying that, and so it isn't coming through. So at one basic level in this particular moment, I think, not speaking and trying to protect what you have might kind of be a bit of a fool's errand, because when is compliance going to actually lead to less attacks from a political perspective? I'm just not sure that there's not kind of a camel's nose under the tent that will just continue to go on until there's a point where somebody speaks up. So in general, I guess one really basic thing is to be clear, to be direct, and to perhaps fight the instinct to close ranks, but actually to engage with people who have a lot of the same questions that you do.
I think that's the role of the news media, to cover the education beat more, more with just really reflecting the reality of where people go to school in this country. I think it's happening now because it's just so much, and it's come under attack in an unprecedented way. So I'm seeing just extraordinary coverage, at least in the past, few months. And then the work of very, like Open Campus and other newsrooms that Chalkbeat and other newsrooms and reporters who have who are funded to do this specific beat. I think that will change the culture. But it goes back to me to the same idea of how the news media, especially mainstream news media, has covered this country, and how it has to be representative of the experience of all Americans. And of course, no single news person can do that, because no person is representative of everything. But it has to be there has to be a variety of points of view and an understanding of what the role of higher ed and universities is in this country. One great example, I think, I live in New York City. I am part of CUNY, and I see how for example, last year during the campus protests, and when the police went into the campus at Columbia, that same night, the same policemen went uptown and also went into CUNY to dismantle the encampment there to the City College to City College, and the media coverage was very different. It was to me, it was a bit painful to see that Columbia got so much attention and CUNY got so little attention when CUNY serves around 250,000 students in the city, and Columbia serves in total around 37,000 students. And CUNY is such an important fabric of the city, and we wouldn't have a New York City without that university. It goes back to a question of equity and representation and understanding the role that these institutions play. But that said, I want to, just congratulate that lots of reporters are actually doing that work. I always feel when we criticize the media, it feels like it's unfair to the colleagues who are actually doing extraordinary work, and there's a lot of great work. I get my information from them, and again, because of the current political climate and the attack against higher ed and education in general, I think we're going to see a lot of good journalism coming to cover this area.
Yeah, I think, in El Paso, we've had faculty members and others say to us that they are getting their information from us as opposed to from their administration. And I think this goes back to my point, which is I think that there are opportunities even in a climate of fear and chaos where even just stating as a higher education institution what's at stake or how you work in the community, I think the community just doesn't hear that enough. And I think, we're happy to step in and do some of that, but there's more I think that institutions themselves can do.
Yeah, I feel like when so much of our world and connection is digital, schools and universities and colleges have a unique power of being local, of being community hubs, and being places where people can convene. And, at our work, I'm just talking about one sliver of our work, but we're trying to tackle a big question. And we alone cannot solve that. And so finding your peers who is working on all of these sides of the issues and building that network together and building that community, I think, is a critical way that we all move forward.
So we're happy to open this up for questions. We've got a stage full of people with journalism backgrounds, and so this is your chance to flip it to us and be the ones asking us questions for once.
Hello. My name is Mark McBride. I work for an organization called Ithaca SNR, and we're doing some research right now on civic engagement in the classroom. And a number of faculty are reluctant to have challenging conversations in the classroom right now because they fear the student reaction. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are, student-led newspapers maybe helping to seed some of those conversations on campus so students are more comfortable having dialogue around topics that are a bit sensitive or can be challenging to comprehend sometimes.
That sounds like a great idea. We're all struggling with that. It's been, it's a very polarized moment, and it's been for a while. And there's, it's become very hard to have conversations about some topics. What we do at the school, we've been looking for strategies to, certainly you're training journalism students, they should be able to engage in very, polarizing topics. So some of the things we do that might be a good idea to experiment is we have classes in which we, the requirement or the exercise is to, for students who hold very strong views about a topic, let's say abortion. They need to do the research and understand the pro-life argument, so the opposite argument, and then they need to argue. The exercise is to write an opinion column arguing against their own opinions and do an honest effort to argue convincingly about that. It's very difficult to do, but the impact of even just that class has been extraordinary. And then it also forces everyone else in the room, in the classroom. We have very small, every class is no larger than 15 students in our case. A lot of our classes are 10 to 15 students because they are like little newsrooms, small newsrooms, and the professor is an editor. So the conversation within those small groups are, we've encourage them, or we require for them to be open-minded and to not react and to really try to understand that it won't change their views. It shouldn't change their views necessarily, but it's important that we are open to understanding views that are so different from ours. So that's one of the things we do, and there's others.
I have a few resources that come to mind that might help ground you or figure out what's the best way to approach this. So even just thinking about how you even define or measure civic health, we commissioned a study from a group called the Listening Post Collective in collaboration with Brown University to look at civic health across a variety of indicators, whether it's voter turnout, existence of community clubs, libraries, or coverage of health insurance. And so it's an interactive map where you can find your region and even have a starting point. What does civic health or engagement look like, and where do we want it to go, through a variety of lenses, which might help give you a more focused way to approach this conversation. Out of the University of Colorado, there's a journalism professor who has put together guides on how to have conversations around thorny topics. So, ones that Graciela just talked about, this may be a way to help even initiate a conversation across a variety of stakeholders. And then there's another resource from the Trusting News Project. It's specifically for educators to have a conversation in the classroom about a student's relationship with news. How do they trust a source? How do they get information and evaluate it critically? And so maybe at all the different layers, by checking out some of those resources, you might have a way to think about how you tailor this for your school.
That was a great question. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Willisha Morris. I'm with Alabama Media Group. I'm actually the first higher ed reporter that we have officially, which is exciting. But my question for y'all is, given what's happening with the education department, how are you preparing your staff, your clients, your customers on what's happening with it possibly being dismantled?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we've been talking with reporters about just what the education department does and doesn't do, what it does and doesn't, what questions it does and doesn't raise in cities and states, where what actually are the legalistic battles that are ahead, and not to get too far ahead of ourselves in talking about a department being gone when there are still significant roadblocks to that actually happening through Congress and other mechanisms. So I think a little bit our role is not taking down the temperature, which is not too hard because the temperature's high, but trying to be very clear with readers about what is actually happening now, what may happen, but what needs to happen for things to come down the pipe. And if you're a student with student loans, how does this or does this not affect you? And I think just being factual. And we are preparing constantly resources guides for our reporters across our 17 locations that give them a history, give them data, give them sources to be talking to who are very again, matter of fact about what's at stake and what right now is happening and what isn't. So I think there's just a lot of confusion, and just being very clear about what the actual reality is today, and to then ground it back again in the local community, and to ground it in state policy too. There's so much interplay between what's happening at states and what's happening at the federal government, not necessarily just on sort of the question of the future of the Ed Department, but when it comes to DEI, when it comes to decisions about federal research and research in general. And so really just, again, being as matter of fact and factual and reporting that way is, I think, the greatest service that we can do for communities to help them, to help them have the proper kind of grounding in what is and isn't going on.
We've got a couple more questions here, so let's try to do a lightning round.
Yeah, hopefully this won't be too convoluted. My name is Chris Morgan. In a former life, I taught English composition at community college. One of the constant struggles I had then was in this changing landscape of evaluating credibility, trying to communicate to students what credibility looks like when they're trying to evaluate it in real time. So I was just wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about your practical experience as journalists evaluating a source for credibility. Like, what kind of things do you look for? What kind of things have you learned about vetting things for credibility?
I think as a journalist who still is a practicing journalist, and as the dean of a journalism school, I think journalism has a methodology to verify and to check that doesn't need to change. So I think that's one of the things that we are still doing in the traditional way, because it's the best way that, because it works. And so, credibility has to do with, one, just getting the story right, and getting it's not just getting the facts right, but just also understanding how to connect them in a way that is truthful. And that's harder than it sounds, or maybe this is hard, but it's way harder than it sounds, because you only have access to a number of sources. But there's a way in which we find, make sure that we are get as close to the truth as we can with this. We've never in the room when things happen, so or mostly never, but so a variety of sources. That's what gives us credibility. And the second thing so getting it right, and then the second, as I said before, if you get it wrong, to correct and to admit your mistakes and to get it right, to get it better.
There's a very intimidating countdown clock, but we're going to push our deadlines.
We're not looking at it.
I'll be fast. Well, I'll try and be fast. Hi, I'm Andrea from a small college in Manhattan, and our students do a lot of amazing, like, student-led service projects and whatnot, and they're always saying, we should do a magazine, we should do a newspaper. The challenges have been, one, that the students coming from, you know, and I'm sorry if anyone's in the New York City public school system, but our students can't really write that well. And so the editing process, and they don't like editing. And then when we have worked really hard to get them right with them, the readership is not that great. So how do we like really uplift and get these students writing ready at a time when they're not writing a lot, and then get people reading either print or digital articles that aren't just like, you know, blurbs?
That for me? I think, well, first, journalism is not only writing. And so I see, and young people don't really, I mean, young people read a lot, but like in a different way than our generation. And also people consume videos and audio a lot. So I would say that engaging, you know, with other formats, allowing other formats, and making sure that everything you do is digital. I wouldn't do a magazine or a paper for young people these days.
And that's what they want. They say they want. But you're right. We've done both.
And make it fun and make it entertaining and relevant to them.
And also, just as people are learning, breaking it down into component parts. I know people always want to do the big magazine story, but building skills can start small, and that can have impact too. And it's not just a big, long story that has impact. So really helping them see that and build skills in more contained ways, I think is helpful.
Thank you.
I would also suggest building in an audience listening period beforehand to figure out why is there a gap in readership. And those skills can really help bring in people into a different role into a newsroom, whether it's audience engagement or even revenue. So community listening before you even begin is critical.
Great. Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Hi, my name is St. George with the My Hero Project, and we have a lot of students that are becoming youth reporters and submitting their work to our website and our competitions. We're doing the Youth Reporter competition right now for prizes, but I find that it seems to be activism driving a lot of the younger kids into reporting. We have one in Irvine that her report about what they were doing with the protected lands actually changed policy for the mayor and gave the people there the drive to get that changed. I'm wondering if where do you draw the lines between activism and reporting, or is there a bridge between them that you see? I'm trying to see the division between that.
I would say that it's great that they care about something. I mean, if someone really cares passionately about something and they want to write about it, that's a great start. I wouldn't, you know, smother that. And then there's, you know, there's you know, you need to explain what journalism is and what's the difference. There's a lot of need for activists in this society, and I think that's a very noble thing to do. And that's not. And also it depends on what you mean by activism. I think there's not such I think different people mean different things by activism and journalism. Yeah. For example, community media, and by that I mean Latino media, Black media, Asian media, immigrant-serving media have been seen by mainstream media as activism versus journalism, and I think that's an unfair distinction. I feel those sectors have been created because mainstream media was either ignoring the realities of those communities or were actually attacking those communities in the past here, and so those outlets were created to advocate for the rights of marginalized communities, and that is, and they created great journalism, and that is journalism, that is not activism. So it depends on what you mean. If you mean that the students are just trying to push a political cause or an ideological cause or an idea without care for what the reality is, to me the only important line here is, are they being factually accurate? Are they verifying the information? Is it truthful what they are saying?
I think I should have said it as they're seeing a need and then using journalism to express that need to everyone. And there's overlap where it could be considered activism only because it wasn't reporting. And I'm wondering Do you see that as a good thing that it's driving the youth into this kind of profession, and that there's a need that's being filled because of this?
Well, I think, journalism has always been about holding power to account at a very basic level, and I think that drive is at the core of how I see the role of journalists, right? To point out where there are problems in society with facts and with independence. I think facts and independence are two characteristics I like to think about as the power of journalism that's slightly different from being part of an activist organization who's geared toward a specific issue and really driving change in a different spot. But I think there are different roles to play, but I think the basic instinct of bringing more people into the conversation and making people accountable to what is going right or not are really important tenets of the work that we do.
I want to thank our panelists and thank everybody for being here today. Lumina is hosting a reception tonight, so we're happy to continue the conversation there. There's cards at the door with the time and location. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.